Today is the first part of this evolution series in which we will try to understand its historical development and some key terms. The idea is that I don't want to start discussing very complicated topics in evolution without understanding the basic concepts. So, in today's part, we will discuss its history and the key terms so that the things we discuss in the upcoming sessions will be easier to understand. The story is very long, but I would like to summarize it and deliver it to you as easy as possible. In the 1830s, young Charles Darwin embarked on a global expedition on the HMS Beagle and observed various species, their differences, and theorizing about them. Along with this, other events in his life led him to leave these ideas, turning to pigeon breeding and other things. One day, his contemporary scientist Alfred Wallace contacted him and told Darwin that he had reached the conclusion that species evolve through the means of natural selection. Darwin, after consulting his mentor, quickly published his theory in 1869, The Origin of Species, presenting the idea that species evolve through the process of natural selection. Now mind you, we are talking about classical Darwinism. Darwinism and Neo-Darwinism, also known as the modern synthesis, are two different things. Therefore, when we talk about natural selection, the context of both is different. Right now, we are discussing natural selection, meaning that in species, traits change over time, and this change becomes apparent in an entire generation. According to Darwin, it's quite simple that the traits that survive are essential for survival, and they get passed on to the next generation through reproduction, and over a period of time, they become fixed. So, this means that natural selection, according to Darwin, is not an active process where nature actively selects favorable traits. Instead, the traits that survive are automatically deemed selected. So, it's more of a metaphor than a selection. This view was later updated, but we will come to that. Today, we are discussing its historical development and key terms. Darwin realized, or at least gave the theory, that species evolve through natural selection and that traits are inherited by the next generation, but how this happened Darwin didn't know about it. The theory of pangenesis and the theory of gemmules, which suggested that there are particles in our body that pass on to the next generation. However, these theories were rejected by the scientists of that time because they didn't meet the scientific standards or were not appealing. But Darwin's theory left an unresolved issue, and here enters Gregor Mendel, a monk and scientist, who conducted experiments on pea plants and concluded in 1865 that traits are passed on individually from parents in the form of distinct factors, some from the mother, some from the father. This is the birth of genetics. But it wasn't named genetics at that time, nor was it taken seriously. It was just a theory that came and went. Then, in the early 20th century, many scientists were working on this theory and resurfaced it, leading to our understanding of the field of genetics. In fact, in 1905, this field was formally named genetics. This scientific field began to develop, and in 1909, Danish scientist Wilhelm Johannsen named the distinct factors Mendel described as genes, thus bringing us from genetics to genes. By now, scientists had concluded that natural selection occurs and that there are genes, but now how to combine genes and natural selection. And there is also the bigger problem of how we can examine a particular species' traits. For example, we can see a mother and father, then their offspring, that some traits come from the mother, some from the father, the complexion of the face, the color of the eyes, and so forth. This is understandable, but how does this change apply across an entire species? That was still a question. And why only talk about species? Why not talk about kinds? These were serious questions. The answer was provided by Theodosius Dobzhansky, who made significant contributions to the science of population genetics. Population genetics is a field of study that examines how the variations occur in inheritance and what happens if those variations don't exist. Amidst all these studies, we also got some new definitions, which are still controversial. For example, a particular term is the definition of species. Now, there is a difference between kind and species. You can easily understand it this way. Kind is like we have a cat and a donkey. These are two different kinds of creatures. But when we talk about species, it mostly means that two creatures that cannot produce a fertile offspring through sexual intercourse belong to different species. For example, if a donkey mates with a mare, the mule they produce is usually not fertile. Thus we can say that the donkey and the mare belong to two different species. So, what we are saying is that two very similar creatures that look alike, even if they can't produce a fertile offspring, are considered two different species. Like many elephants, in fact, there are two major types of elephants in Africa that are considered different species because they cannot interbreed. By now, you might have realized that this science had become very scattered. So how to gather it together? Because there are some problems. For example, when we talk about natural selection, as we discussed earlier, natural selection is to be taken as just a passive filter, meaning the species that survive are deemed to have been selected. It's not that nature actively selects them. But now that we have the field of genetics, and we are saying that only those genes that are beneficial for the species' survival and reproduction survive. This is where we have a problem, because now we are not saying that the ones that survive are selected, but rather we have to select first. Nature has to select those genes or new combinations that are very important for the species' survival and reproduction. This is where modern synthesis or neo-Darwinism comes in, because now the new view is that nature is no longer a passive filter, but rather nature actively selects those variations or mutations that occur at the genetic level, and the basis of selection will be that they are beneficial. This is a brief overview of the historical development and key terms. Now, let's make one thing clear, that after this episode, when we mention Darwinian evolution, we will actually be referring to modern synthesis or neo-Darwinism. You might wonder why. Well, because the textbook biology taught in schools, universities, and colleges around the world is based on this. So, when we talk about natural selection, we will not be talking about a passive filter, but an active mechanism that selects beneficial variations or mutations. At the same time, when we talk about Darwinism, it will be neo-Darwinism as a whole. In the future, we will discuss the scientific problems and philosophical problems in this story one by one, mentioning natural selection, random mutation, population genetics, and the scientific problems in these areas, and why neo-Darwinism is not compatible with science.